I guess I do. I feel like I'm on Let's Make a Deal. All right, I think this will work, and I can do it this way, and this way you will hear me, and I can mess with this. First of all, thanks for having me, and for the nice lunch. My background is really mostly in the geosciences. I have a split appointment. Half of my position here at KU is in the Kansas Geological Survey, and the other half is in the Department of Anthropology, where I'm a full professor there. And although it's kind of funny because I'm not an anthropologist by training, my undergraduate degree and my master's degree were both in geography, and my PhD is in geology. But because I've spent about 30 years now working with archaeologists, and the endowed program, the Odyssey program, which is mentioned, you'll see I'm executive director of that program. Part of the agreement of becoming the executive director was I had to have a position in the anthropology department. So I know enough about archaeology probably to be dangerous. I've got one of the grad students here who is going to try to keep me honest in this presentation. But I've spent a lot of my career working in various parts of the world with archaeologists and basically applying geoscience to archaeology. And hopefully by the time you hear me go through all this, you'll see there's a lot of application. It is very relevant to the field of archaeology. All right, let's see if this will advance. For some reason it doesn't want to. Oh, wait a second, here we go. I'm going to try this, and I think it will work. Unfortunately, lighting here is going to make it a little bit difficult for you to see some of the images here. But we're talking about the people in the Americas. When did people arrive in the New World? So talking about North America, Central America, South America. If we go back to 1927. This is the Folsom site. I suspect some of you have heard of Folsom artifacts, maybe. The Folsom site was reported as the first locality in the New World where they actually found the physical remains of people, in this case artifacts, with extinct species of animals, in this case of bison. And what they found, if you can see in this image, it's a little bit hard to see it, but if you look right there, you see there's a projectile point. And these are the ribs of extinct bison. And so that, as I said, in 1927 was the first recording of evidence of people living with Ice Age animals, going back to the Pleistocene, greater than 10,000 years ago. What people don't really know very often, or you don't hear about it much, is that actually this individual, Williston, who was at KU during the late 1800s and early 1900s, a classic example of a Renaissance man because he served as a professor of geology and anatomy, okay? And he was the first dean of the School of Medicine, and he was also a paleontologist. So he was obviously a very brilliant man. And because of his interest in paleontology, he would send people that were working with him out to western Kansas to look for the remains, particularly of Ice Age animals. And he sent two of his colleagues, H.T. Martin and T.R. Overton, out to Logan County. And they were wandering through the Smoky Hill River Valley and were in 12 Mile Creek, which is a tributary to the Smoky Hill. And if you notice this cliff here, at the foot of this cliff, they found actually the remains of about a dozen bison, extinct bison. These were about a third larger than a modern bison. And in fact, if you go over to the Museum of Natural History here, you'll see, I think they still have at least one of them on display, and they have the remains of these bison. And but what's interesting is there was a point, a projectile point that was found in the bone pile. Now this was, more than 30 years before the discovery of Folsom. And what's interesting is that the sketch, there's also a bad photograph of it. It looks like a Folsom point, and the bison remains have since been radiocarbon dated, and they date to about 10,400 or 500 years ago. They're within the period of Folsom. So this was actually the first discovery of artifacts with bison remains. Now, why don't a lot of people know about it? Well, it turns out that, and this is how the story goes, that the projectile point, and this was a huge find, Williston was invited to the Chancellor's house for a tea party to show off this artifact, and it was passed around, and it never came back to him. And he was too embarrassed to ask who had it, and so the point was lost. And so we don't really have the physical evidence. It's gone. Think about this. This should be in the Smithsonian. The first evidence of people and extinct animals in the New World. But you just rarely see it mentioned in the literature. Also, I should mention that as paleontologists, I think the fact that they were paleontologists, not archaeologists, that may have also had some bearing on this 12 Creek site not getting much attention. But I've actually since gone back to the site with Jack Hoffman, who's a professor in the Anthropology department. He's an archaeologist. And one summer, this was back in the early 2000s, they tried to relocate the site, particularly looking for the bone bed. And 12 Creek, the actual channel of the creek is right there. And I think what's happened is it's migrated up against that cliff and has removed the bone bed. If anything was left, it's gone. They found a few bone fragments at the bottom of this cliff. Right in here, you can see where they excavated. Just a few fragments of bone. So we're pretty sure this is where the discovery was made. Because the notes from Williston's team are kind of sketchy, but with the site's gone. Okay, but still, it's a very important site. If we look at, I always think in radiocarbon years. So I'll be talking about radiocarbon dates, and we start pushing back earlier than about 10,000. You have to add about 2,000 years to convert it to calendar years. And I'm not very good at math, never have been. But, so Folsom time is approximately about, it's about 12,300 to 12,700 years in calendar years. And you'll see some squiggle room on each end of that. But that's, a lot of the radiocarbon dates fall in that range, okay? And then another discovery. This is, perhaps you've heard of the Clovis site, very important locality in Clovis, New Mexico. An air view, and you see the south bank where a lot of the discoveries were made. Here's a ground view of the Clovis site today, looking at this old quarry. And in 1933, excavations there at the Clovis site uncovered the remains of mammoth, the giant elephants that are now extinct. And again, the lighting is not very good, but if you look closely, right there, you can see the base of a Clovis point sticking out. So the points were found with the remains of these mammoth. And Clovis points are very diagnostic, these beautiful spear points. And these are not arrow points, they were on spears. They have these flutes, you can see these grooves. There's one side, this is the same point, just different views of it. So here's one side with a flute, there's another side with a flute. They're very distinct, very diagnostic. An archaeologist who knows anything about artifacts will see a Clovis point and go, this is a Clovis point. And so these were used to kill big game, kill mammoth, mastodon, American camels, the extinct bison, a variety of animals that lived during the Ice Age that are now extinct.
And that's up close to the spear point.
What's that?
They're up close.
They're going to have to get close to these animals to kill them, because you're not shooting them with a bow and arrow. You're going to have to get up and spear them. They used what they called an atlatl, which did send at a certain distance, but still you have to get pretty close to these animals, which could be a dangerous situation. I've got a great cartoon. I wish I had stuck it in here from Jack Hoffman. It shows the mammoth chasing the hunters. But anyway, yeah, that's a good point. Dangerous. So if we look at Folsom time, now this discovery was made during the 30s. It pushed people, what I'm saying is it pushed the arrival of people back in time to the oldest radiocarbon dates on Clovis now are close to about 11,600 radiocarbon years. So again, if you want to put that into calendar years, add 2,000 years to that, okay? So the question that I address, this is the science that I'm involved with, is really this question. Were people in the Americas before Clovis time, were they here earlier than 11,600 radiocarbon years ago? And so what I'm doing is using geoscientific methods to try to determine whether, and I'm focusing mainly on the Great Plains, whether there's evidence for people here before Clovis. We commonly hear the term pre-Clovis or pre-Paleo-Indian. So that's my mission in life. If we look at, there are a few sites that have pretty strong evidence that people were indeed here before that time, before 11,600 radiocarbon years ago. And one of them is the Monteverde site in southern Chile. And if you look here, there's Monteverde. By the way, here's the Clovis site right there. And radiocarbon dates from Clovis are about 11,000 to 11,500 in that range. And the idea is that people came across from Beringia when this was an ice-free corridor during the Ice Age. Water levels were down in the oceans, and there was actually a land bridge connecting Asia and the Americas. The idea is that people came across Beringia's land bridge, moved either through the ice-free corridor or along the coast. But at Monteverde, the radiocarbon dates are a number of dates, but there are some pretty solid dates of about 12,500 radiocarbon years ago. In other words, about 1,000 years before Clovis. And when you stop and think about it, I'd have a hard time imagining Clovis people getting down following this route. You would think that people would have to get down there before Clovis time. There are older dates at Monteverde going back to even 33,000 years ago, but though there are some issues about whether they're associated with archaeological remains. But I think it's pretty solid that the dates around 12,500 at Monteverde are associated with cultural materials. In fact, this is actually an artifact, believe it or not. If you look, it's a little bit murky in this lighting, but what that is chaw, chewing. Okay, so what makes it interesting? This came from the site. So here's Monteverde, and here's the ocean. We're off the coast, off the Pacific coast. There's an embayment here. You're not going to be able to see it because the lighting's bad. I show during that period, sea level was lower. And so Monteverde was actually even further away from the coast. But what's interesting about this is it's seaweed and some other medicinal plants. This person probably, and it's loaded with human DNA, this person probably had a toothache. And what would you do? In those days, you'd get a medicinal plant, or in this case, there are several plants, and you would chew on it. So they literally found the chaw, and this is a seed that came out of it, of these medicinal plants. And again, this is carbon-based, so it's dated to about 12,500 radiocarbon years ago. And there's other lines of evidence that are really strong at Monteverde. So, Monteverde to me stands as a really good example of evidence of pre-Clovis. Yes?
Can you tell us what that would be in calendar years, the 12,000?
So 12,500 would be 14,500 calendar years ago. So it would be, it's roughly about 1,000 years older than Clovis. So 1,000 years before Clovis time. There's another site, I'm not even going to talk about it here, in the central part of Texas, on Buttermilk Creek, which has been in the literature quite a bit recently, that has people here perhaps as early as about 15,000 calendar years ago. but there's some questions about the dating method to it. There's always seems to be some problems with these early sites. They use a non-traditional, it wasn't radiocarbon dating, it's called OSL. It's got problems, has big standard deviations. So the sites like Monteverdi, the reason I wanted to use Monteverdi is it's one of the few, I think, that is really, really strong. It's hard to find a problem with it. People have tried to challenge it, but I think a lot of the evidence there speaks for itself. So it's to me and a lot of my colleagues, is a really good example of a site that, that's pre-Clovis.
Do they think that the people in Monteverdi came all across that?
Well, they think that people from Monteverdi would have come down. See if I can back up here. Basically would have come down followed a path because, based on DNA research, some people have suggested they might have gotten to Monteverdi from Australia by island hopping. The DNA evidence doesn't support that. There's more of an Asian connection when you start looking at DNA evidence of modern populations. Yes?
At one time I saw some people talking about Africa and South America being connected.
Yes, but that was millions and millions of years ago. It was before modern humans. So yeah, they were connected, but you're talking about really hundreds of millions of years ago.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Other than just general curiosity, what is the significance of these dating issues? Why is it important to you to find out? Why is it important to you?
Well,
other than the fact that it's just there to be done.
Well, if you're interested in our origins,
Okay.
then you need to think about where did we come from.
Okay.
That's what intrigues me. This is a toolkit from Monteverdi. This is what it would look like. It really doesn't look like anything Clovis. You don't see Clovis projectile points. It's a rather unique assemblage of bone tools, other objects, fairly nondescript. But the point is that they do have artifacts at Monteverdi. They're human artifacts. So it's clearly an archaeological site. So what I've said here is the acceptance of the Monteverdi site in southern Chile dating to at least 12,500 radiocarbon years ago, or about 14,500 calendar years, opens new pre-Clovis possibilities for North America. Okay? So if they were in South America at 12.5, they would have had to pass through North America to get there, right? Which means they should have been in North America before 12.5. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay? That's what really intrigues me. So what was the spatial pattern of Paleo-Indian colonization of the Great Plains? That's the area I'm focusing on. And when did people actually arrive in the Great Plains? So those are two of the questions I'm trying to address. Several sites in the Great Plains hold potential pre-11.5 evidence. These include La Cena, Nebraska, the Lovewell site, the Canorado site in Kansas, and the Burnham site in Oklahoma. I'm going to talk about all these except Burnham. In fact, I'm substituting another site that we recently found, the Sharman-Mandel site. I'm sticking in to talk about that instead of Burnham because I've not worked at Burnham. I've seen the site, but the other sites I've worked at, and the Sharman-Mandel site's really intriguing, as you'll see in a second. I'm going to begin at La Cena, which is this little red dot right there. Shows other sites with possible early, pre-Clovis sites. So I'm going to go to La Cena, and then we'll drop down to Lovewell, and then we're going to go to Canorado. And we're also going to capture the Sharman-Mammoth site in between before I talked about Canorado. This is the La Cena Reservoir in southwestern Nebraska, and the bank you see in the background here is about 30 feet tall, and so the lake has been, a lot of wave action has been eroding this. This is actually all, believe it or not, this is all windblown. Back in the Pleistocene, there was a lot. You think you have a lot of dust in your house or apartment now? Back then, it was a very dusty environment. There was a lot of sediment being blown around by the wind and accumulated meters and meters of sediment. And it's hard to see it again in this lighting, but You can see there's something going on down here. These are excavations, which would be right about, well, almost near the bottom of that bank. So it's really deep. It's far below the surface. And one of my colleagues, Steve Holland, who actually did his PhD here at KU, I was on his PhD committee. He was working with Jack Hoffman, and Steve was really interested in the Paleo-Indian period, these people that were here particularly during the end of the Ice Age. And he was especially interested about where they were getting their materials for making artifacts, which something I'll point out as I go through this. But Steve was working at the Lasena site, so he's about, oh gosh, I want to say maybe 15 feet below surface here, standing on a platform, and he's looking down at the remains of mammoth. These are fragments of mammoth bones. And he's a real expert on the pathology of animal remains. And what captured Steve's attention was a lot of the bones, the way they were fragmented, looked like they'd been struck with an object or had been broken. We call them green bone spiral fractures. There's a very distinct characteristic of a bone. If you pull on it, say pull on a rib cage, the way it breaks when it's still fresh creates a spiral fracture. So you're seeing a lot of these spiral fractures and impact features, and just the spatial pattern of the artifacts. Well, as he's calling these artifacts, some people don't agree with him, but the spatial pattern of these bones, he's actually gone to Africa, found a dead elephant, and whacked on the bones while they were still green to see how they splayed out, how they fractured. So he was looking at modern analogs. And the patterns he saw in Africa look a lot like the patterns he sees here, in terms of the way the bones are fragmented and splay out from the central area. And he refit these four fragments of a mammoth femur, and you can actually see what looks like a point of impact, suggesting someone was whacking on it, either to go after the marrow or to get smaller bone fragments to make bone tools. If you go to Europe and look at the Paleolithic, it's very common to see bone tools. And so, he's very convinced that these are artifacts. These bones are actually artifacts. Just another example, a negative cone of percussion at the point of impact of a thick cortical mammoth femur segment. You can sort of see the geometry here. It comes up here and comes up here. Again, this is something he sees as really requiring a human agency to create this. Now, you might argue that, well, okay, maybe Clovis people did this, that they came, because mammoth were around, obviously, during Clovis time. Maybe this is just a Clovis site. Well, the problem with that, so this is a diagram of that big exposure, that cut. And if you look, we're about, we're over 8 meters below the surface. And there's the site. And there's the radiocarbon date, 18,000. Okay, 18,000 radiocarbon years ago, which would be 20,000 approximately calendar years ago. So that's pushing people back, more in the order of, let's see, do the math. So instead of 11,600, well, we're looking, 7,000 years, okay, before Clovis. Okay, that would have been what we call the last glacial maximum. It would have been the peak of the last glacial episode. There was no ice there. We know that was further north, but it would have been a very, much colder environment. And so when archaeologists, a lot of them, see these dates, and look at Steve's bone artifacts, they immediately question them as being bone artifacts. And they'll say, okay, well maybe other animals, other mammoth, were walking around and stepping on these bones, creating those spiral fractures and impact features. Steve will argue vehemently against that because of the pathology. And he's done enough work to show that he's actually gone to zoos and had elephants stomp on green bones to see how they break. And they don't look anything like what he's seen at Lasena or some of the other sites, one of which I'll talk about in a second. The other thing that's kind of interesting that Steve points out, if you believe the business of mammoths walking around stepping on these bones, is that there are rib bones at Lasena. These are the most fragile bones. and the ones that would be least used by people, because they like to use thick cortical bone to make tools or to go after marrow. But what his point is that wherever he's found rib bones at the site, like these, they're not broken. So they're the most susceptible to breakage. So did the mammoth go, well, I'm going to step on the leg bone, but I'm going to step over the ribs? No. So that's, the bones that are most susceptible to breakage by other animals walking around are these ribs, and yet none of them are broken. And these are the bones that people would avoid using. See where he's coming from, his logic? So I think it's a pretty good argument, but I will tell you that a lot of archaeologists still won't buy it. Until you find lithics, in other words, stone tools, they will not buy a site like Lovewell or Lucena, either one. So the other one, as I mentioned, is Lovewell, which is again in red right there. We're going into north central Kansas, into Jewell County. And when the lake level goes down, they lower it every year in the fall. And you can't see them. There's a bunch of flags that we've pinned. There's lots of bone fragments of extinct animals, and including a beautiful Clovis point that has been recorded there. So we know Clovis people were there. And back in the 60s, when the lake was really low, Tom Whitty, who used to be director of the Kansas State, or the state archaeologist of the Kansas State Historical Society, was notified by the Bureau of Reclamation that manages this lake that a mammoth was coming out in the area that had been exposed during the lowering of the lake. And you can see, unfortunately, again, the lighting is not very good, but that's Tom way out there looking at this. And it turned out to be a pretty much an intact mammoth. And he had a geologist from the Kansas Department of Transportation come out who really didn't know a lot about superficial geology. And he looked at it and he said, I think the sediments here are too old to have any human involvement here. And so Tom, who's squatting down there, hearing this, decided it wasn't anything archaeological. So he walked away from it and, in fact, let a high school class come out and excavate it. And so the bones all disappeared. But, again, enter Steve Holland. When he learned about this, Tom had made really good notes about the location of where this mammoth was. And so when the lake went down again, this was during, I think it was in 2001 or thereabouts. That's Steve standing up in the background. I went out with him, and they were able to relocate the spot, and they re-excavated it. And sure enough, there were just some remains, not many, because most of the animal was gone. But there were some fragments of bone. And more importantly, at the tip of a highly polished bone what he would consider to be an artifact, the very end of this is polished on both sides. So it looks like a tool. And, you got to think about how you could make something like that. In fact, it's even beveled. How could that occur during natural processes? If it was being chewed on by some scavenger, you should see teeth marks. They're not there. So this does indeed look like a bone artifact. This looks like, if you show this to an archaeologist, that looks like a flaked bone biface. If these were lithics, if these were stones, you go, no problem. These are artifacts. Bone flakes produced on the mammoth bone, and the flakes actually refit. He could put them back together. So these all kind of scream out, this is archaeological. These are products of archaeology. These are some sketches showing the impact points, negative flake scars. Again, these look like artifacts. Shows the point of impact. Well, it's fine until you get the radiocarbon dates on the bone. 18,250, almost exactly the same as Lucena. Okay? So when archaeologists see that date, then they go, let's look at these artifacts again. Oh, no, they're not artifacts. Because they know how old they are. Again, it bothers a lot of archaeologists because there are no lithics. There's no stone tools. But Steve will argue vehemently that these are artifacts. This is a pre-Clovis site. Okay? So if any of these or other sites yield unequivocal pre-11.5 evidence of human activity, then our perspective on Paleo-Indian archaeology in the Plains region will be significantly altered. And the only effective way to evaluate the possibility of pre-Clovis is to systematically study deposits and soils of the appropriate age in settings which would have been conducive to human settlement and other activities. And this is where I really come in. Because what I'm looking for are particularly buried landscapes that date to pre-Clovis time that people would have been walking around on. Those landscapes then got buried, and hopefully the archaeological record got sealed and preserved. And so, if you look at all those dots, those are places that I've studied throughout the Central Plains, Kansas and Nebraska. I think 47 or so. I've spent about 20 years doing this, and I'm not going to go through all these spots with you. That would put you to sleep immediately. But I will just point out something very quickly. Basically, what I do is I look for exposures like this. This is along the Chicaskia River in south central Kansas, south of Wichita. And if you look right there, notice how dark it is right there? That's actually a buried soil. That was the land surface 10,000 years ago. So you went, and that's in radiocarbon years. So you went back 12,000 calendar years ago, you'd been walking right there. Well, all of this is sediment that was deposited by the Chicaskia River and basically buried it. In other words, every flood of that deposited sediment. So over 10,000 years, all the sediment piled up. So I'm constantly looking for what I call my windows into the past. And that's one of my windows. And if you zoom up close, you notice I've actually got radiocarbon dates of 10,000 and 10,800. So this is where Clovis people would have been, at the very bottom of this bank. And so what I've dated here is I date the carbon in the soils. So the carbon in the soils tells me basically how old that buried landscape is. Does that make sense? Pretty kind of straightforward. And so, as I said, this is how I spend my life, looking along rivers like these. This is the Cimarron River in extreme southwestern Kansas. And if you look off to the side here, right there, I'm going to take you to a riverbank. And there's a little bit closer look at it, and even a closer look. And these dark layers you see are all buried soils. So those used to be at the land surface, and they're now buried. And if you notice the radiocarbon ages, the oldest date I have is 12,600. That's getting into pre-Clovis time. So if there were pre-Clovis people, this is where they'd have been walking, down here. 12,500, 10,002, those still would have been Paleo-Indians, and these would be late Archaic people. So I'm basically reconstructing the landscape and determining the age of these buried landscapes, and this is where we go look. So it's systematic. I'm developing a model that can be systematically used to search for this early evidence rather than just wandering around randomly in the landscape trying to figure out where to look. Okay? Yes?
When you find a site and start working, do the locals get interested in what's going on? And do they invade when you're not there?
Well, I don't know if they invade when I'm not there, but they often, I have to go through landowners. Most all of this is on private property, and they usually think I'm crazy when I tell them what I'm going to do. I'm going to go out and clean off a bank like that and date the soils. But then once they come out and see what I'm doing, they typically get very interested in the history because it's their land, and they like to hear about the early history of that landscape. So they do tend to get interested. Now, places like this, I'll tell you, I didn't find anything, but at least gives us a lot of these buried soils we might be able to trace laterally. And so if we keep looking, we now know where to look, and we keep looking, the idea is hopefully we'll find something. Yes?
If you were ever to find an artifact when you're digging,
right.
Who does that artifact belong to if it was on someone's land?
It belongs to the landowner if it's private property. And we encourage the landowner to allow us to at least study it, take it back to KU. And oftentimes they'll even agree to let us have it. Some want it back, some don't. It just depends on the landowner. We rarely get turned down from going on property. In my career, I think maybe once or twice. It usually takes some talking. And like I said, oftentimes they think I'm so crazy, they just say, go do it and have fun, knock yourself out. But anyway. This is Maddox Draw. This is also in southwestern Kansas, a small stream. Again, the lighting's terrible, but you can see there's a real dark layer at the bottom here, and we'll just kind of bring in the dates. So again, I'm dating the soils. So way down here, we're 13,300 years ago. That's, again, where pre-Clovis people would have been walking, now deeply buried. So, we're looking, it's the proverbial needle in the haystack, but it's at least a systematic way to look at this landscape. The one side I'll talk about in a little more detail. This is Colorado, right on the Kansas-Colorado border, near the town of Colorado. And this is I-70 right there. And when they were constructing I-70, this was before their laws were in place requiring any type of archaeological investigation. This is Middle Beaver Creek. They straightened the channel so they wouldn't have to put as many bridges there. And in straightening, because the channel used to cross right about in here, in straightening it, they created some exposures. And as it turns out, there are 3 sites. I'm going to talk real quickly about each one of these. This one, this one, this one. So again, there's I-70. And I'm standing on the highest ground there looking down into Middle Beaver Creek at this exposure. And there's I-70. You can see it in the background. It goes right over the site, really, a portion of it anyway. And this is Site 105. There are 3 areas. Most of our efforts focused on Area A. But this underscores this approach of, buried soils being important things to focus on. Back in '76, when they were straightening the channel, they started to expose some bones down right about in here where you see that shovel. And so they had Don Lindsay come out. He was with the Denver Museum of Natural History, a paleontologist. And so Don came out to look at these bones, and he started excavating. And if you look really close, you can see that's the femur of a mammoth. And this was in 1976 when Don was out. And there's a close-up of the mammoth. There was also a cobble right next to it. And Don, in his notes, mentioned that he saw what might have been artifacts. And so Steve Holen, who I've talked about already in detail, when he went out to Colorado, he got a position with what used to be the Denver Museum of Natural History, called now the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. He became their curator of archaeology. And so he started going back through the files, and that's how he found out about Don Lindsay's work out at this place, that mammoths were found, and that immediately caught his attention. So he started looking at the collection of bones that Don had brought back to the museum. And he noticed that some of these bones, like this radius, because Don continued to work there for a number of years. In '81, these are some of the bones that Don brought back. They had these spiral fractures on the end that, again, look like they're human. In other words, somebody pulling on a bone and creating this spiral fracture. And also, again, what looks like a bone tool. This is also bevel on both sides. I mean, it looks like something used to carve wood, but clearly it looks like a tool. Faceted cortical limb bones, again, looks like artifacts. And this really got Steve excited. So in 2001, we went out to the site, Jack Hoffman, who's in the middle of that image, and we started looking along this bank, and not only did we find more bones, but we found artifacts in the slump at the bottom of these banks, clearly artifacts.
What
And
kind?
mostly, I'm going to show them to you.
Arrows?
No arrows, no projectiles. I'm going to show you mostly flakes and some tools, some bifaces. But I'm going to show you those in a second. There was a portion of a camelops. That's camel. That's American camel. It's a one-hump camel. It's not like your Egyptian camel at all. But they became extinct at the end of the Ice Age. But there were clearly remains of a camel. And so we were thinking this might actually be a Clovis site. In fact, would be the first Clovis site discovered in Kansas in a buried context. We find Clovis points on sandbars, gravel bars, in the middle of farmers' fields. But prior to this discovery, no Clovis site had ever been discovered in a stratified context in Kansas. So we got excited, thinking we have finally found an in situ, in place, buried Clovis site. So we were very excited about that. You asked about the artifacts. This is what was eroding out of this. There's a buried soil. Before these four artifacts on the left, these guys right here, what's interesting, they're made of alabates. And the closest alabates is the Panhandle of Texas. So this material came from the Panhandle of Texas, which means these people were transporting alabates. It's a high-quality material. They were transporting it from great distances. The one on the right is flat-top chalcedony, which comes from Colorado, from the flat tops of Colorado. So again, transport of material from great distances. None of this material is local. So we decided to do some test excavations in Area 105, and there we are at the site. There I am standing looking at this area where Don Lindsay had originally found those bones. We reopened it. In fact, Don, who was retired, but he came out with us and said, you know, this is about where I did the work, and sure enough, we excavated, and sure enough, gosh, I wish the lighting was better in here, but perhaps you can see there's a big mammoth limb bone crossing another mammoth limb bone, and these are camel bones right here. So, camels, that's American camel.
Oh my gosh.
So this really got us excited. Some of the mammoth bones from that level were fractured, spirally fractured, looking like it's something cultural. And there I am looking at these bones, and there's a radiocarbon date on that bone, 12,215, which is pre-Clovis. However, we're back into the same problem. At this level, at this depth, there were no lithics, no stone tools. So the bones look like they've been modified by people, and they may have been modified by people, but we do not have any lithics from that level. However, above it, see this dark zone? This is actually two buried soils. In that horizon, we have Clovis artifacts, Clovis age, and right about here we have Folsom, and above there we have what we call late Paleo-Indian. But this is the first discovery of both Clovis and Folsom in a buried stratified context in Kansas, and for that matter, the Central Great Plains, which includes Nebraska. So this really is a huge find. While we don't, here's that lower mammoth camel layer. Well, we don't have any lithics from that, and it still could be cultural. We've got both Folsom and Clovis at the same site. Okay, so it's just a huge discovery. Just very quickly, we'll jump over to this site right here nearby, and there's our excavations, and you can see this dark soil right here, and in that dark soil we found there's a flake, and we found mammoth bone next to it, and again, alabates from the Panhandle of Texas. Those are the artifacts. And above it, again, the lighting's terrible, but that's a humerus of a bison that dates to about 10,400 radiocarbon years ago, which is Folsom time. So there's a Folsom component at this site also above the Clovis. Finally, 106, which is down here on the other side of the interstate, there's our excavations, and what we're looking at is this buried soil. Remember, I'm always focusing on these buried soils. You see that dark layer there? There's a close-up of this. You really see this dark buried soil, and there's a limb bone of a bison sticking out that dates to 11,000 years ago, which is Clovis time. And this is a plan view. In other words, we're standing over an excavation unit looking at the floor of the unit. And there are three artifacts, here, here, and here. And this is the Clovis horizon. And we zoom in on that, this beautiful end scraper made on a prismatic blade. And this material is from the Edwards Plateau of Central Texas. So think about where Central Texas is. This is like near Austin, that area. Think about how far that is from western Kansas. I should have done a Google search to get the actual mileage. But it's a long way away, okay? So again, these people were transporting this exotic material from great distances. There's also these Folsom end scrapers. There were quite a few of them that were discovered, and these are made on Hartville chert, which is from the Hartville uplift of Wyoming. It's a really beautiful material. Jack Hoffman, who's studied Folsom, he considers these to be diagnostic, and they're typically used as hide scrapers. So the idea was there should be a bison kill, because Folsom people really liked bison. There should be a bison kill nearby. And lo and behold, one other thing, Folsom, this is one of the few projectile points we actually found. These are different sides of it, so we're looking at one side and the other side. A Folsom tip and the base of the Midland point, which is contemporary with Folsom. So, we're not finding a lot of points, but, here's an example where we did find some. You see the end scraper. Okay, so the question about where's the bison kill, about, 70 meters away from where we're doing most of the excavation, on the opposite bank, we're going to take a look at this exposure, and there were actually several layers of bison remains. And so here you can see the skeletal remains of a bison, which dates to 10,854, which is either really early Folsom, old Folsom, or at the early end of Clovis. So it kind of overlaps both. But, this was likely, this old arroyo now filled in would have been a great trap. If you're driving bison, that would have been a good place to trap them and kill them. So we think that's where the kill site was. So what's the significance of the Canorado locality? It's the first in situ Folsom site in the Central Plains, the first in situ Clovis site, has a possible pre-Clovis cultural deposit, and evidence for long-distance transport of the materials, the lithic materials that they were using. And to put Canorado on the map as being one of the most important sites in North America as an early site. Finally, I'm going to go through this very quickly. The Charmin Mammoth site, which we just recently discovered, rather fortuitously. This is in Scott County in western Kansas, and that's a Google air view of the site. Smoky Hill River Valley is just off this. So we're on the bluffs. And the farmer was putting in terraces, cutting terraces, and in the process, about a half meter below the surface, he exposed the remains of this mammoth. You can see the rib bones, big scapula, and there's some of the limb bones. But what was intriguing was about 50 meters from the remains was this, what we call a napping pile. You can see the circular pile has about 1,000 artifacts in it of Smoky Hill jasper from the Smoky Hill region. If you can imagine somebody sitting there making tools, the debris from that is going to create a pile, and that is a napping pile. It is at the same depth as the mammoth remains. It's not right in the remains, but it's next to it, which would make sense. If you're butchering a mammoth, you're going to be off to the side, having someone constantly sharpening your tools or remaking tools. The only concern, as I said, there's always something that seems to compromise a site, is that when they excavated around this last year, they noticed that the edges of the circle were fairly abrupt. And so one possibility is that sometime later, after the sediment accumulated and buried the mammoth, later people dug a hole and were doing napping there. It's a possibility. I'm not sure why they would be there, other than since that's it, the mammoth is there. So we got to do more work there. So this summer we're going to go back. This is going to be a multi-year project, but we've exposed maybe 10% of the mammoth. But what makes us particularly excited is, let's see if you can see, there we go. There's the radiocarbon date on the bone, 13,470. So 13,000, approximately 500 years ago, which makes it 2,000 years older than Clovis. You know, I think this is a really high potential site in Kansas for pre-Clovis. What we need to find are again, the old problem, we need to find some lithics probably in context with the bone pile. So we're going to keep looking for that bone pile and looking for artifacts.
If it is pre-Clovis, how does that change perspective?
Well, I mean, it's not so much changing perspective, it would confirm what we think, that there were people out there before Clovis time. So, you know, this would, if we could demonstrate this is pre-Clovis, this would probably be one of the strongest sites in North America, if we can clearly make that connection, that there were people here before Clovis time. So I note here, currently there are multiple models that can account for the peopling of the Great Plains, and the possibility that this peopling process occurred prior to Clovis time remains open. So what I'm saying is, you know, we still don't have the smoking gun. Certainly not in the Great Plains, but sites like Charmin, I think hold really high potential. So we're going to continue just, you know, exploring the landscape, you know, looking at these buried landscapes, continually looking for cultural material in places where we have soil dates that are older than Clovis, and going back to places like Charmin and fully exploring them to see if there's, you know, clear, irrefutable evidence of people here before Clovis time. That is, I've talked way too long. Yes?
Where would these people have come from?
Well,
Pre-Clovis.
they probably would have come from across Beringia, from Asia, and crossed the Bering land bridge. There's been an idea more...
That was open earlier?
That was open during the Ice Age. In other words, it was a landmass. There's been a hypothesis proposed by Dennis Stanford at the Smithsonian that people might have come from Solutria, from France, and traveled by boat across the North Sea, the North Atlantic, using marine resources, following the ice front, and came in the U.S. from the northeast. It's very debatable whether that's true or not. Some of the reason he says that is when you look at Clovis artifacts, they have some similarities to Solutrean artifacts. There's also as many dissimilarities when you look at them.
Yeah, there was the National Geographic article about that.
Yes. There's a book that just came out on that whole argument that was published by Smithsonian Press. There was a recent article in Smithsonian, in the Journal of Smithsonian, that talks about that. So, you know, but my opinion is the jury's out. It's a possibility. They just have to prove it. But, you know, which direction people came from, it's possible they came from Europe. There's strong evidence genetically, you know, the DNA evidence points more to Asia when you look at populations.
Well, the Russians cited Rolfe, are they excavating over there?
Yes, the Russians.
Over there.
Excuse me, the Russians.
They even ate one.
Yeah, no, the Russians have been looking in Siberia quite a bit, looking for early sites because they know people. There's clear evidence that people were moving from Siberia across the Beringian land bridge into Alaska. And so, yes, there's, in fact, some American teams have been working in Siberia with the Russians, looking for these early sites. There's a lot going on. It's a very popular topic.
One of your students I've become acquainted with, he's no longer at Walmart. I walk at Walmart, and he's an archaeology student. Mm-hmm. And I said, what are people going to think when they uncover a Walmart hundreds of thousands of years later? That's a sure sign of human activity, right?
Yeah, that would be. That would be. Yes.
I looked up that distance. I couldn't find that town. I'm not trying to spell Jarman. Is that where you found it?
Well, Canorado.
I got Canorado.
Yeah.
That's over 800 miles
yeah.
from Austin, Texas.
Yep. So
I wonder, given that they're using materials from that far away, it suggests that they might not have found suitable materials nearby earlier, and that the bone may have been the best thing they had.
That's one of Steve's arguments, that particularly during that period with all the lust that's falling out of the sky, it would have buried a lot of outcrops of rock, which there aren't many bedrock outcrops in western Kansas anyway. That there was not a lot of good material available, and so people would have used bone more often because of the lack of good lithic resources. That's one of his main arguments. That's a really good point. So, you look at these streams today out there, and there are cobbles in the streams, but a lot of them are really poor quality materials they would not have wanted to use. So, I think Steve's argument is very believable. It's convinced some people, but a lot of traditional archaeologists, paradigms are hard to break. They just don't, unless you see stone tools, they just don't think it's a site. But I think Steve's arguments are pretty solid.
One other thing, we were talking about how far you can throw a spear with an atlatl earlier.
Yeah.
I don't know anything about the paleontology, but I've thrown spears with an atlatl, and it's amazing. You can definitely bring down a target at 50 yards with a spear and an atlatl. Really accurate.
If you're really good.
Yeah. I have friends who would never miss a target a yard wide at that distance.
Yep. I'm not sure I want to get within 50 yards of a mammoth, though. Because the closer you get, the better odds you're going to have of bringing it down. But yeah, atlatls are effective especially if you're good at it. And I suspect, if these people are going to survive, they're going to have to be good at it. Bison are really hard to contain. They might have had a tougher time with bison. You really need to drive them into a gully or off a cliff. They're really hard to get. They're very suspicious of people and very hard to approach. So oftentimes we find the remains of bison in old gullies at the foot of cliffs. There's a site in western Kansas called the Burtwood Creek bison jump, where they drove them off a cliff. That's what you usually had to do to get bison. Mammoth actually may have been a little bit easier to approach.
Is this specifically those larger extinct bison
Yes.
that were so hard to get close to?
Yes.
Because I've seen a herd of them crossing a road in Montana, and it was hard for us to get through.
Yeah. No, of course the bison have been domesticated, but even domestic bison can be really difficult. But the fact that we always see them, the kills are typically in draws or off the edges of cliffs, suggests that they probably had to somehow injure them first before they killed them. There are a lot of bison drives that have been recorded in the Americas, where they literally drove them into something and then dispatched them.
Some of our people are dispersing, so we ought to thank you before they're all gone.
Okay, well, thanks again for having me.